On March 15th, 44 BC, Julius Caesar bled to death on the floor of the Roman Senate, stabbed 23 times by men he had pardoned, promoted, and trusted. Brutus and Cassius believed they were saving the Republic. They believed that by killing one man, they could turn back the clock and restore the old order. They were wrong. The Republic was already dead. It had been dying for decades, hollowed out from the inside by corruption, inequality, and the growing realization that a sprawling empire stretching across 3 continents could not be governed by a committee of wealthy men arguing in a marble building. Caesar's murder didn't save Rome. It guaranteed that the thing Caesar had started would be finished by someone else. The question was no longer whether Rome would be ruled by one man. The question was, which man? To understand why, you have to understand what the Roman army had become by the middle of the 1st century BC. It was no longer a citizen militia fighting for homeland and honor. That army was long gone. Ever since the reforms of Marius, decades earlier, the legions had been filled with volunteers from the lowest rungs of society. Landless men, foreigners, people with nothing to lose and everything to gain. They didn't fight for Rome, they fought for their general. He was the one who paid them. He was the one who led them to victories, and victories meant plunder, and plunder meant survival. A general who won battles became, in the eyes of his soldiers, something close to a god. They followed him not out of patriotic duty, but out of self-interest. Their loyalty was personal, not institutional. And that loyalty could be weaponized. A brilliant commander with a devoted army didn't need the Senate's permission to act. He was power itself, walking and breathing. Caesar had understood this better than anyone. He knew how to win soldiers over. Through personal bravery, fighting in the front lines, stirring admiration in men who respected nothing more than raw physical courage. Through an unbroken string of victories that turned every campaign into a profit-sharing enterprise. His talent as a general was, in a very real sense, an investment that his soldiers made with their lives, confident that the returns would be worth the risk. And for the civilian population back in Rome, Caesar's glory reflected onto everyone who supported him. A drop of his prestige fell on each citizen who cheered his name, and in exchange, they gave him their votes, their loyalty, their willingness to look the other way as the old republic crumbled. When Brutus drove his dagger into Caesar's body, he didn't kill Caesarism, he ensured it. The Roman people, meaning the class of citizens who enjoyed rights and freedoms, were exhausted. Half a century of civil wars, political assassinations, and street violence had left them desperate for one thing above all else: order. They wanted stability. They wanted to enjoy the prosperity their empire had generated. They wanted someone strong enough to keep the slaves in line, the conquered provinces obedient, and the barbarians beyond the borders at bay. The senatorial oligarchy had proven incapable of providing any of this. Caesarism, the rule of a single strong man, was the only system that had a chance of holding the empire together. And there was a deeper truth at work. Rome aspired to dominate the known world. But a city, as a symbol of universal authority, is abstract, distant, hard to rally around. A man, on the other hand, can be invested with the aura of divinity. He can become a living symbol. Caesar had understood this, or at least intuited it. His assassination caught him on the verge of implementing a political program of enormous ambition. He never got to finish it, but he left behind someone who would. His name was Octavian. He was Caesar's adopted nephew, and he was 19 years old. Octavian arrived in Italy to claim his inheritance, and immediately demonstrated a political instinct that belied his age. He sought out Caesar's veterans, the old soldiers settled in southern Italy who still worshipped their dead commander's memory. He bought the loyalty of legions freshly arrived from Macedonia, paying each soldier 50 drachmas out of his own pocket. He recruited new troops in Campania. Mark Antony, Caesar's former lieutenant and the most powerful man in Rome at that moment, initially supported Octavian. But Antony had ambitions of his own, and in 43 BC, he tried to oppose the young heir by force. He failed. Octavian marched on Rome with 8 legions at his back, and 3 additional legions summoned from Africa defected to his side the moment they saw which way the wind was blowing. The Senate, staring at 8 legions outside the city gates, elected Octavian consul. His adoption by Caesar was officially confirmed. Brutus and Cassius, the assassins, were condemned to death. But Octavian was smart enough to know that he couldn't hold power alone. Not yet. Mark Antony was still dangerous, so was Lepidus, another powerful general. Rather than fight them both, Octavian made a deal. The 3 men formed a triumvirate and divided the Roman world among themselves. Octavian received Sicily, Sardinia, and Africa. Antony took Gaul. Lepidus got Spain. Then came the Purge. 200 senators and 2,000 knights, the wealthy elite of Roman society, were proscribed. Their property was confiscated. Many were killed. Among the victims was Cicero, the greatest orator Rome had ever produced, the man who had spent his life defending the Republic with words. Words, in the end, were not enough. On January 1st, 42 BC, the Senate and the Roman people officially declared Julius Caesar a god. Octavian, with calculated modesty, accepted only the title Divi Filius, son of the god. It was a brilliant move. He didn't claim divinity for himself. He simply positioned himself one step below it, close enough to bask in its glow, humble enough to avoid the resentment that had gotten his adoptive father killed. Meanwhile, across the Aegean, Brutus and Cassius had been busy. They controlled Asia Minor and had assembled a formidable army. 80,000 infantry across 19 legions, 13,000 cavalry, and 4,000 archers. In July, they marched from Sardis. By early autumn, they crossed the Hellespont into Europe. Many of their soldiers were veterans who had once fought under Caesar himself. To secure their loyalty, each man was promised 1,500 drachmas, with centurions receiving 5 times that amount. Loyalty, as always, had a price. Of the 43 legions the triumvirs controlled, only 28 could be committed to the campaign in Macedonia. 8 of those were sent ahead by sea, with orders to cross into Thrace and harass Brutus and Cassius in the mountain passes, slowing their advance. The 2 armies converged near the town of Philippi. Brutus and Cassius each established a fortified camp, linked by defensive works. Mark Antony arrived with the main force, joined the 8 advance legions, and set up his own camp a short distance away. Octavian, though seriously ill, was carried to the battlefield on a stretcher and placed in the camp. Whatever his physical condition, he intended to be present. The numbers were roughly equal, 19 legions on each side, but Brutus and Cassius had more cavalry, and crucially, they had better access to supplies. Their fleet controlled the sea routes, and food could be shipped to them from the east. Antony and Octavian, on the other hand, were in trouble. The surrounding country was poor. Bringing supplies from Italy by land was slow and uncertain, and by sea it was impossible, as long as the Republican fleet dominated the waters. Time was on the side of Brutus and Cassius. Every day they waited, Antony's army grew hungrier. Antony understood this perfectly. He needed a battle, and he needed it soon. So while he paraded his legions each morning in full battle formation, banners flying, making a show of readiness, a detachment of his men was secretly working behind the cover of marshland reeds, building a hidden road through the swamp. The road would bring him behind the enemy camp, cutting Brutus and Cassius off from their sea supply lines. For 10 days, the deception held. Then the Republicans discovered it. What followed was chaos. Cassius's forces attacked the construction works, but Antony had anticipated this. He wheeled his troops northward and stormed Cassius's camp directly. At the same time, on the opposite end of the field, Brutus's soldiers, acting on their own initiative without waiting for orders, charged Octavian's position and broke into his camp. The battle had split into 2 separate fights, each side winning on one end and losing on the other. But the outcome hinged on a single, tragic miscalculation. Cassius, seeing his own camp overrun, believed the entire battle was lost. He didn't know that Brutus was winning on the right wing. Without that knowledge, unable to see the full picture through the dust and confusion, Cassius made his choice. He killed himself. The Republican army lost its most capable commander in a moment of despair based on incomplete information. Brutus regrouped. He reoccupied Cassius's camp, repaired the fortifications, and settled in to wait. His strategy was sound. Antony's supply situation was desperate. A fleet carrying reinforcements to the triumvirs was intercepted and destroyed at sea. Time was now overwhelmingly on Brutus's side. All he had to do was hold his ground and let hunger do the rest. But his soldiers wouldn't let him. They were restless, overconfident from the first battle, eager for a decisive fight. And on the afternoon of November 16th, 42 BC, against his better judgment, Brutus gave in to their demands. The Second Battle of Philippi was not a battle of maneuvers. The marshy terrain left no room for flanking or subtlety. It was a grinding, head-on collision. Antony told his men the plain truth: win or starve. There was no other option. His soldiers fought with the desperation of men who had nothing to fall back on. Meanwhile, Octavian attacked Brutus's camp. The Republicans broke. They were pushed beyond the camp walls and routed. Brutus retreated to the high ground with 4 legions, tried the following day to rally his men for a counterattack, and was refused. His soldiers had had enough. Brutus killed himself. The last defenders of the Roman Republic died with him. Octavian returned to Italy. Mark Antony went east to Egypt. 2 years later, the empire was redivided. Octavian received Italy, Dalmatia, Sardinia, Spain, and Gaul. Lepidus got Africa. Antony took everything east of the Ionian Sea, and then Mark Antony made the mistake that would cost him everything. He fell in love with Cleopatra. It wasn't just a love affair, it was a political catastrophe. Antony dreamed of building a great Eastern empire, rivaling what Alexander the Great had created. In 36 BC, he launched a campaign against the Parthians. He won some early engagements, but the campaign collapsed, and he retreated with 30,000 fewer men than he had started with. Instead of regrouping, he sank deeper into his alliance with Cleopatra. He repudiated Octavia, Octavian's sister, a personal insult that Octavian would never forgive. He proclaimed Cleopatra Queen of Kings, and her son by Caesar King of Kings. He handed over Roman provinces, Asia Minor, Syria, Armenia, Cyrenaica, to the Egyptian queen, without the Senate's consent. He was giving away pieces of Rome's empire to a foreign monarch. Octavian saw his opportunity and seized it. A masterful propaganda campaign painted Cleopatra as the villain, the Eastern temptress, corrupting a Roman general and threatening the integrity of the empire. The Italian cities rallied around Octavian. The Senate stripped Antony of his authority. War became inevitable. In September 32 BC, Antony assembled his forces on the shores of the Ionian Sea. 60,000 infantry across 19 legions, 12,000 cavalry, 10,000 light troops, and a massive fleet, all paid for largely with Cleopatra's money. He transported his army to Greece, but he could go no further. To invade Italy, he would have had to abandon Cleopatra, and since much of his army and his entire fleet belonged to her, that was impossible. To bring Cleopatra to Italy would turn even his remaining Roman supporters against him. He was stuck, and Octavian knew it. Every day Antony waited was a day his army consumed supplies that had to be shipped from Egypt. Time, once again, was the enemy of the man who hesitated. At the end of winter in 31 BC, Octavian made a bold move. He crossed the Adriatic with part of his forces, appeared north of Actium, and established a fortified camp connected to the sea by double lines of earthworks. Agrippa, his brilliant fleet commander, seized key ports in the Peloponnese, severing Antony's supply line to Egypt. Antony was forced to act. He attempted a flanking maneuver against Octavian's camp, but his cavalry defected mid-battle. He retreated south. Cleopatra proposed a naval battle to decide the campaign, and Antony, out of options, agreed. Between 35 and 40,000 men were loaded onto 400 ships on each side. What followed was less a battle than a collapse. During the fighting, 200 of Antony's ships abandoned him, their crews switching sides. Left with only a handful of loyal vessels and Cleopatra's squadron, Antony fought his way through the enemy line and fled toward Egypt. His land army, what remained of it, surrendered to Octavian. The following summer, Octavian landed in Egypt. Antony tried to resist, but his troops betrayed him. On his way to Alexandria, Antony received word that Cleopatra was dead. It was a false report, but he believed it. He fell on his own sword. Cleopatra, captured shortly after, took her own life with poison. Egypt became a Roman province. Actium was more than a military victory. It was a civilizational fork in the road. If Antony had won, the capital of the empire would likely have moved to Alexandria. The cultural and political center of the Western world would have shifted east. The entire trajectory of European civilization might have been altered. Instead, power stayed in Rome. The West held. In 27 BC, Octavian performed a masterpiece of political theater. He formally restored the Republic. It was a fiction, and everyone knew it, but fictions matter. The Senate, grateful and docile, awarded him the title Augustus. Power was concentrated completely and permanently in the hands of one man. Augustus didn't just seize the state, he rebuilt it. Among his most important reforms was the reorganization of the army. During the civil wars, legions had been hired muscle, loyal to whoever paid them. Augustus created a permanent, professional imperial army that swore allegiance to the emperor alone. He reduced the number of legions to 28. Roman citizens served for 20 years and received land or money upon discharge. Auxiliary units were formed from non-citizens who served longer terms and earned Roman citizenship for themselves and their families upon retirement. It was a system designed for stability, and for 2 centuries it worked. Roman military power reached its peak under the Emperor Trajan. After conquering Dacia, Trajan turned east, defeating the Parthians and absorbing Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Assyria into the empire. But even Trajan discovered the limits of expansion. While he was winning battles in the east, revolts erupted in Palestine and Syria behind him, forcing him to divert forces and abandon his gains. The empire had grown so large that putting out fires in one province meant leaving another exposed. And that was the fundamental problem. The borders of the empire, the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, were not arbitrary lines. They were the farthest extent to which Roman power could reach without collapsing under its own weight. Defending those borders required an ever-growing army. Under the early empire, there were 25 legions. By 120 AD, 28. By 300 AD, 130. By 400, 170. But these later legions were smaller, weaker, diluted. By the 4th century, a legion might number only 1,000 men, and its ranks were filled not with Roman citizens, but with foreigners, non-citizens, and mercenaries whose loyalty was transactional at best. The deployment of these forces tells you where the pressure was greatest. 10% of the army guarded Britain, 20% watched the Rhine, 30% held Syria, and 40%, the largest concentration, stood on the Danube. That river was the most threatened frontier in the empire. To hold these immense borders, the Romans built something extraordinary. Continuous lines of fortification, punctuated by towers and castles, stretched across Europe and the Middle East. Paved roads connected the edges of the empire to Rome, allowing legions to move rapidly to threatened sectors. Every road and every fort was built by the soldiers themselves. A Roman legionary was as much a construction worker as a fighter. He carried roughly 40 kilograms on his back during a march. Standard pace was 24 kilometers a day with full equipment, 30 or more without. Every evening, even on a routine march, a temporary camp was constructed, a rectangular enclosure with gates, intersecting roads, and defensive ditches. A single camp could shelter 2 legions plus auxiliaries, 15,000 men. If the army stayed in place, the camp was fortified further. Nothing was improvised, nothing was left to chance. The Romans considered war an art, not in the romantic sense, but in the artisan's sense, a craft, refined through centuries of practice, study, and transmission. The Greeks had started the tradition of analyzing battles, evaluating generals, dissecting the causes of victory and defeat. The Romans carried it further. Their historians didn't just record what happened, they judged it. Titus Livius offered assessments of entire campaigns. Polybius left detailed descriptions of legionary organization. The great generals themselves wrote about their wars. Caesar described his campaigns in Gaul and his civil wars, justifying his actions for posterity, but also providing a manual for future commanders. Trajan wrote about his Dacian wars, though that work, tragically, was lost. This tradition of military thinking continued right up to the empire's final years. In the 4th century, a writer named Vegetius compiled a comprehensive manual of military art, drawing on the works of Cato, Trajan, Hadrian, and Frontinus. Frontinus himself, who served under the Flavian emperors, wrote 2 remarkable works. One laid out the principles of warfare, the other, Strategematicon, was a collection of stratagems organized by subject. Chapter 1. How to conceal your plans from the enemy. Chapter 2. How to discover the enemy's plans. This was professional military thinking, cultivated across centuries by men who understood that war is won first in the mind. And yet, for all their brilliance, the Romans carried within their system a fatal weakness. From the earliest days of the Republic through the height of the Empire, infantry was the queen of the battlefield. Cavalry played a supporting role, given serious attention only in the 3rd century under the Emperor Gallienus. Hannibal had demonstrated, centuries earlier at Cannae, what devastating cavalry could achieve when used for flanking attacks and encirclement. The Romans learned the lesson tactically, but they never fully adapted at the institutional level. They never built a cavalry arm capable of matching the mounted warriors who would eventually tear the empire apart. When the barbarian horsemen came sweeping across the frontiers, the legions, those magnificent, methodical, disciplined formations of foot soldiers, found themselves fighting an enemy they were structurally unable to defeat. The story of war in the ancient world begins with nameless hordes wandering in search of better land, fighting over water, pasture, survival. Hundreds of thousands of years of unbroken violence shaped the human soul in ways we still carry today. The sensitivity we feel toward killing, the horror and fascination we hold for the brutal act, these are reflexes etched into us across millennia. And from that same well of primal experience came something else, the epic. The first heroes humanity ever celebrated were fighters. Gilgamesh, Achilles, men who stood in the line between life and death and refused to step back. With the rise of slave states, war became organized. 2 armies in rows, facing each other across a field. A single maneuver, the frontal attack. The Greeks refined this with the phalanx, perfected under Philip II of Macedonia. Then came Epaminondas, whose oblique formation and flank attacks proved that wars could be won in the mind before they were won on the field. Philip and Alexander demonstrated that grand strategy, the ability to paralyze an enemy psychologically before the first spear was thrown, was the highest form of military art. The Romans took it further. The legion, flexible and adaptable, could change formation on the fly, respond to terrain, and execute complex maneuvers under the command of a gifted general. In the hands of a Caesar or a Trajan, it was the most responsive military instrument the ancient world had ever seen. But history does not stand still, and the empire that had been built by the most disciplined infantry in the world would ultimately fall, in part, because it could not adapt to the mounted warfare of a new age. The ancient world began with men swinging clubs in the dark. It ended with legions standing on the banks of the Danube, watching the horizon, waiting for the horsemen they could hear but not yet see.